Hello, this is Russell Moore, and you're listening to The Russell Moore Show, brought to you by Christianity Today. Every week, we explore here conversations and questions from a Christian perspective to help you sort out how to live as a follower of Jesus in confusing times. And this week, we have a conversation to seek to do just that. Esau McCaulley is contributing opinion writer to the New York Times and an assistant professor of New Testament at Wheaton College, author of a lot of books. I'll talk about at least two of them here in just a minute. I read Esau, everything that he puts in the Times. It's always both beautifully written and really gripping and compelling in argument. And the same thing is true. I was reading an early copy of a book that you all will be able to see later on this year, I believe in September, but it's called How Far to the Promised Land? One Black Family's Story of Hope and Survival in the American South. And man, it is the best thing he's written. I mean, it really is. It really is. And that is saying something. But I found myself just lost in the book, which is about the highest compliment that I can have when you're reading something and you kind of lose track of what time it is and where you are. It is really poetic and prophetic at the same time, and that's hard to do. And so I'm really thrilled to talk to Esau McCaulley. Welcome to the show today.
Thank you. That's very high praise. And it was terrifying writing a memoir, so I'm glad that at least one person likes it.
It's one of those books that I think people are going to remember long after they've read it. So I look forward to hearing about our listeners reading it later or listening to it in an audiobook. But also, you're the author of the book Reading While Black, and we're going to talk about that in terms of biblical interpretation. I laughed about your talking about being on a panel one time. In a mostly white audience. And
yeah.
Why don't you tell us what happened?
Oh, yeah. The book opens and with this scene with I'm sitting on this panel with Lecrae, and they asked the question, what is the most racist thing you ever experienced or something like that? And I don't answer the question. But the way that what I was trying to get at is like how African Americans are taught to tell their story, and how the way we are taught to tell our story sometimes normalizes our suffering. In other words, there's this assumption that we went through these horrible things and we overcame them. And it's the job of the reader to condemn the horrible things that we went through and cheer for us as we kind of survive. But because I'm sitting on the stage, you know that whatever it was, I was going to survive. And so there's a way in which you're taught to tell the story of yourself as this heroic character who overcame suffering and made it to the promised land. But the reason that I didn't tell that story or the story of what I experienced was because our stories, we're more than the worst things that happened to us. And that I didn't want to tell a story where I was simply the hero who overcame these hard things, but that other people who didn't overcome those hard things, people who experienced racism and it broke them, their stories are important too. And so that was my way of saying, in my book, I wanted to challenge kind of the traditional hero's journey that marks so many narratives.
Yeah, I laughed because your answer was, we'll pass on that one.
Yeah.
And I thought, now that is a way to respond to a bad question.
Well, the funny thing about it is I wasn't sure because, I went and looked it up. This is on YouTube. No offense to the person who asked the question, because it wasn't hers. It was actually from the audience. And I said, did I actually say that? So I went and Googled it on YouTube. And if you go and look it up, you can find this actual lecture and you can hear me saying, I think we'll pass. Because I remember when they asked the question, I looked at Lecrae and Lecrae looked at me. He's like, are we going to do this? And I was like, you know what, Lecrae, don't even worry about it. I'll speak for the two of us. So he may not know. I sent him a text that says, yeah, you're in the opening of my book, Lecrae. Just so you know, you might show up. You might just wonder what happened at that event. But it was a great event besides that one moment.
What would have been for whoever asked that question
Yeah.
for what they were actually trying to find out,
Yeah.
what would have been a better question?
Well, I think that what they were trying to do was to inspire empathy.
Mm-hmm.
That was the purpose. So it wasn't actually the goal was, if people feel bad enough about racism, then maybe they will fix it.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that you remember this, right, Russell? I forget when we did this. We always argue about stuff as Christians. Remember we had the war on empathy?
Yes.
Remember
Oh, yeah.
this? It's like,
Yeah.
Don't be
Mm-hmm.
too empathetic.
Right.
And so what has happened is we've learned that telling these stories doesn't work if people are determined not to be empathetic. They'll find a reason not to feel the feeling because they realize that feeling the feeling is the entryway into changing. And so we even have people who say, as Christians, then you have to be careful of being too empathetic towards people who are poor, who are suffering. And so I don't know. So one perfect example of this is a huge historical example. It's like Emmett Till's mother. Emmett Till is, he's murdered, and she has an open casket funeral because she's, I want America to see what they did to my baby. And the idea is that if you show the open casket, America will see, and then they'll stop. But there's always a segment of the population that just kind of sees empathy as dangerous. Now, of course, it's possible to be so empathetic that you lose moral reasoning. Mm-hmm. But I think the ability to weep with those who weep is a basic Christian idea.
Yeah. Well, why do you think it is that we're in a situation where we're arguing about things as really basic as empathy with one another instead of actually getting to where the real problems and issues are? I mean, doesn't it seem like we are constantly in the middle of these little fights about nothing that seem to distract from what are really gaping chasms in front of us that need to be addressed?
This will sound more polemical than I want to sound, but I can't think of it other than it seems that in certain circles, they're closing off all roads that might lead to real engagement in certain social issues as Christians. And so the problem isn't with empathy itself, it's where empathy leads. And so if I know, for example, if I see what is happening to African Americans or the water crisis that was going on in Flint or anything where someone is suffering, or the immigrant crisis, and you say, I feel empathy for them, and that empathy leads you to reconsider certain policies or issues, then that is seen as dangerous. So the best way to prevent that is to kind of cut off these pathways in. So, for example, if you say, hey, in the Bible, and I look in Isaiah and I see how Isaiah or any of the prophets care both about fidelity to the one true God and personal sin and structural injustices in society, like these three things are just in Isaiah. He has these concerns. Jesus shows these concerns. Well, that's a problem, because if the Bible says these things very clearly, then if you believe in the Bible, you have to deal with them. So the best way to do it is to actually not argue the exegesis, but to find a way to close off that exegetical discussion. And so what you do is you say any discussion of structural sin is antithetical to the gospel, even if it's in the Bible. And so you find these arguments that are used to fortify certain positions that are not actually biblically defensible. And that sounds more polemical than I want it to sound, but it's true. And so empathy is a problem because empathy is one tool that's supposed to open up the possibility of a Christian to care about some of the other suffering peoples in the world. And some of that suffering is seen as, that empathy for suffering is seen as theologically dangerous, leading to error. But that doesn't necessarily have to happen. In other words, that slippery slope, people don't always fall down it. Now, it is possible for empathy to go too far, that empathy can so cloud our judgment that we lose track of truth. But that doesn't mean you kill empathy. It just means that you're discerning in your use of empathy. We tend to, and I don't know why, and maybe I have some opinions as to why, we want to shrink everything down to like what is and isn't in the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
And we then say, well, if it's not a part of the gospel, then I don't have to care about it. I say, well, what does Christianity teach?
Mm-hmm.
And when you begin to see what Christianity teaches, then the scope of the conversation can enlarge, and we can maybe make some progress. And like how the truths of Christianity inform the imagination that then influences how we live and function in society. Those are the kinds of things, right? What does it mean to be a Christian? And how does my status as a Christian shape how I see the world? And then how does that influence how I engage the world?
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't have to necessarily cite a Bible verse to justify a particular thing. I can say, this is how Christianity shapes how I view things. And then I present it to people as to say, here's as best as I can discern a vision of how we might live together, influenced by what I think about, what I think is true about the world because I'm a Christian. And so that's at least what I try to do, is to try to help people see how Jesus shapes how I see the world, not necessarily show them, here's the Bible verse to justify every single decision that I make.
Yeah. Well, your book, Reading While Black, really provocative title, of course, echoing back to Driving While Black and other things. There are a lot of people that would say, now, wait a minute, the Bible's the Bible, and you don't have a particular interpretation because of your experiences or where you are.
Yeah.
So why would you do a book called Reading While Black and just say reading the Bible?
Yeah, I always say, I mean, people don't actually believe that.
Yeah, right.
I mean, and this is at least important to understand by analogy. And this kind of helps people into it. So there's something called the Journal for Scottish Theology. And I've never heard anyone email Scotland and say, you can't have a Journal for Scottish Theology. There is no Scottish theology. It's only theology. Or we have a thing, British evangelicalism. Yeah. And anybody who's read British evangelicalism, J.I. Packer, John Stott, N.T. Wright, British evangelicalism has a slightly different vibe than American evangelicalism. Mm-hmm. Because we understand that the culture into which we come influences the way that we talk about things, but that doesn't rule out truth. I'll probably give you a less polemical one for people who want to clip this and take it out of context. So anybody who studies the Reformation, this is true. You study Reformation. Everybody understands you don't just begin with Luther. You put Luther in context. This was what's going on in Germany during his time. This was happening in the Catholic Church. This is how indulgences were functioning. In other words, Luther was not living in a decontextualized world. Luther was influenced by the particular things that were happening in Germany at the time. Mm-hmm. And that led Luther to ask a particular set of questions. And then Luther, because of those questions, came to truthful statements about what the Bible actually said. In other words, Luther was influenced by his German context, the politics, and the Catholic Church of the time. And that sent him to the Bible with these kinds of questions. And because those experiences led him to ask questions of the Bible, and he saw the Bible as God's word, he nonetheless came up with a true answer. Mm-hmm. And people will say the same thing. You can't understand Calvin without understanding Geneva. In other words, everybody else understands that just because you're influenced by your circumstances, it doesn't necessarily mean that you deny the ability to come to true statements. And so when I talk about African-American biblical interpretation, I'm not saying that African-Americans have state things that are true only to African-Americans. Mm-hmm. I'm saying that our experiences cause us to bring certain questions to the biblical text. Other people might not ask, but when we ask those questions, the Bible as God's word to us answers us. Mm. And because, you ended up having in the Reformation a certain set of core principles that existed apart from Luther and Calvin and all of these people, they're all existing at the time because they were all a part of these common sets of questions that came to common answers. And in the same way, African Americans throughout American history had a common set of problems that were being pressed down upon them because they're African American. What is a person? What's the relationship between Christianity and state religion, and all of these things? In the data, the theological conclusions they've come to, as an answer to that question is what I call African American biblical interpretation, and that is no different than any textbook anywhere that talks about German theology, Scottish theology, British evangelicalism, Australian evangelicalism, American evangelicalism. Everybody gets a culture except for American-born ethnic minorities. Mm. And we tend to think that there's only one American culture, but there's American subcultures. And American subcultures sometimes have unique questions. And so I don't actually believe that the idea of socially located truth being also objectively true is actually controversial. What's controversial is I highlight the distinctive contributions of the Black church, which is surprising, right? I didn't actually think that was going to be what people actually took as being the controversial part of the book. People have found the very idea more controversial than it is. And it's only because I took a general truth that existed in theological discourse and applied it to African Americans.
I remember a historian talking one time about how early Christianity spread, first century Christianity. And he was talking about trading routes carrying the gospel and about treatment of women and all of these distinctives of Christianity. And he stopped to say, now, some of you are going to say that I'm just giving a naturalistic or cultural explanation, but I'm not. I'm telling you how the Spirit was moving.
Yes.
Here. And I thought that was a really good explanation.
And I think that if you look in history, we tend to think of theology as this decontextualized thing. But like God comes to us in and through culture, which is why anytime you want to do good biblical studies, the first thing that you do is you look at the Greco-Roman Empire and the Jewish world of the first century. And you said you can't understand Paul without understanding his context. Even though Paul was influenced by Second Temple Judaism, in the world in which he lived, in the Greco-Roman world, nonetheless, the things that he said were like true and applicable to other people. I'm not comparing like what I'm saying I'm not saying I'm Paul. That's not what I'm saying. Right. What I'm saying is his theology is never decontextualized. It's the truth through culture, not truth around culture.
So what would be some specific questions that the Black church would ask that to other people might miss in our time?
I'll give two very concrete ones. Very few of my white brothers and sisters have ever had to answer the question, is Christianity a Black religion? In other words, African Americans have to ask the question, we've been told most of our lives, Christianity is a white man's religion, and it's alien to us. And so because of that, in the Black church in particular, there have been a tendency to highlight the universal nature of the gospel in a particular way. We're not the only ones who can say it, right? It's not that this is something that's invisible to other people, but the idea of God's purposes, including all nations, is particularly emphasized in a unique way. A second one that gets to this is anthropology. And if you go and you just look, and this is not controversial. Go and look and say, okay, you look at different points in time in America, the anthropology, what we thought of a person was functionally wrong. We had a hierarchy of, white people at the top, Black people at the bottom, other ethnic groups are in between. And it was African Americans who came and said, no. The Christian doctrine of Imago Dei that existed before us, we appropriated that and used that to reform American understandings of a person. And so the particular emphasis on the theological and cultural and political implications for the Imago Dei over against like other Americans at the time who had a hierarchy. So we're the ones who are saying eugenics and African Americans being inherently unintelligent and all of these things are incorrect because of what the Bible says about what a person is. And so it's not that idea that we're all made in God's image and therefore we deserve to be treated equally is unique to Black people and only we could see it. But because of our social location of being people who are denied the Imago Dei, we emphasize that. And because there was a political and economic benefit for majority culture people to deny that, their social location in that case distorted their anthropology. And so this anthropology and the universal nature of the family of God, which aren't unique to Black churches, but are emphasized to Black churches. The other one, I'll say three. I talk about canonical preaching a lot. Because of the way that we think about how you communicate text, anyone who's ever gone to a Black church actually knows that like Black churches probably preach more from the Old Testament than majority culture churches. And we tend to refer to all of these stories no matter what the sermon is. It doesn't matter what you're talking about. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are going to show up somewhere in the sermon because we tend to draw on the entire Bible to make any individual point. which is a different way of thinking about how you do biblical interpretation than the oftentimes majority culture context, where it is, I need to find a particular verse that addresses a particular issue and then apply it. And African American, because for a variety of reasons, one of which is because of the way the slavery was argued in the antebellum period, in which the enslavers would like to use one verse to kind of make their point. And African Americans had to go for a canonical route to make their point, which is God willed our freedom. And so that habit of canonical interpretation isn't unique. Other people talk about canonical interpretation, but it's a distinctive contribution or distinctive emphasis in the Black church. And so what I'm really talking about is the handing over of customs that mark Black Christianity. And there's the best way to describe that community is to call it African American, because those are the people who are doing it.
You're writing for the New York Times now, and so you're writing to Christians. A lot of us Christians who read the New York Times. I was asked by Nick Kristof at Christmas. I think he said, "What would you, as a Christian, say to New York Times readers?" And I said, "Well, I am both a Christian and a New York Times reader. I don't think those are necessarily mutually exclusive categories. There you have Christians, but you have a lot of really secular people also. What have you learned so far about being able to connect with that broad of an audience?"
Well, I think I've learned that everyone has to have their own voice and how they write and how they engage in culture. And for me, I try to find a place where I can show people how being a Christian influences how I see the world. And that may seem to be like overly simplistic, but there's a way in which, in every cultural issue that there's people think like the Christian take and like what they might perceive to be the non-Christian take. And you can say, well, it's my job to give the Christian take, like so that people see Christians in the public square. We kind of assert our place. And I tend to not just want to do that. It just doesn't inspire me as a writer. What I try to do is to say, well, how can Christianity offer me a unique way into a topic? And rather than coming confidently, I talk about how I actually experience my faith, which is maybe because I'm one of those empathetic people. That's maybe my weaknesses. I want to take on board the concerns and the fears that people have about Christianity and about how we function in the world, but also want to say, but there's still something beautiful about what we do and how we function. And so I tend to write in such a way, I'm not simply asserting, I may be asking perhaps. And maybe I want to suggest that my role is not the same role as an apologist or even a pastor. So if I'm in a church, I can just say, open up your Bible and look at this passage, and the Bible says it, therefore you do it. That's kind of how we do it. If I'm writing for CT, I can do that. I can just say, it says it here, therefore we all agree we must do it. But what if the people don't agree with the text? Then you have to show them, here's how Christianity shapes my imagination. I try to write with the knowledge that life is hard. And sometimes we can write as Christians in such a way that if you just believe this stuff, things get better. And sometimes believing this stuff makes things objectively worse in the sense of you suffer more.
Yeah.
And it's really easy. People talk about moderation. It's not about moderation. It's really easy to be a tribe. Tribes have speaking tours. Tribes have natural places where they buy your books. Tribes have like circles on social media where they love you. If you stay in your tribe and you just read the tea leaves and you just do what your tribe tells you, you never get any trouble. But if you actually try to say, in each moment, how can I discern what God wants me to do and follow it, even if it gets me in trouble with my tribe on the left and on the right? Then you often find yourself suffering. You got to go, it would be much easier if I just took the majority side of the people I want to be with. And so when I write with the realization of simple solutions aren't always as easy as we may think that they are. And I try to do all of that without sliding into a wishy-washy, therefore we don't know anything. It's like, I call it like a sophisticated reappropriation of orthodoxy. How do we find our way back towards truth acknowledging the ways in which other people who held to that truth disappointed us, and acknowledging the ways in which getting at that truth is sometimes hard to get to. And so like those things aren't simple.
Yeah.
And my writing maybe reflects that kind of struggle that I've had in my own life. And so there's sympathy for the reader rather than me yelling at the reader and telling the reader they should believe me or agree with me or be a bad person.
That really resonates with me. I was just talking to a friend yesterday about how many people I know who have fallen apart in their early 40s.
Yeah.
Lost the faith in their early 40s. And that's exactly, I mean, life is difficult. This cross carrying
Yeah.
doesn't stop at
Yeah.
some point.
So the funny part is, not to circle everything back to the book. The reason it's called How Far to the Promised Land is precisely because I thought there's so many times, not just in my life, but in the life of my family, where it felt like we were going to make it, but we weren't there yet. And there was more journeying to do. And the point of How Far to the Promised Land, isn't this the question, right? That we're always trying to get to this place where we can just like stop and rest.
Yeah.
Like we've done it. And the truth is, like, none of us makes it to the Promised Land this side of God's return. But no matter how far we get, and this is the thing that I think that I'm trying to get in the book, no matter how far we make it, each person's struggle, and this is like the kind of the one of the central theses of the book, each person's struggle to try to find that place is instructive to us, not just as object lessons on our way, but each individual life in the struggle to find meaning is beautiful and important. And sometimes we only think of valuable lives as the people who make it further down the road to what we think of the Promised Land is. But if I am someone who grew up in a context of poverty, and most of the people who I know lived and died in poverty, then I either say all of those lives were wasted, or I say God was at work even in those difficult and broken people. And that those people didn't just like spur me on to like out of those communities, but their individual lives matter. Like the central character in the book who's interestingly enough, rarely in the book. He's at the beginning and the end, and he comes and goes, is my father. And he left us when I was a young kid, and my life was definitively shaped by that decision. But I want to say, well, who was he apart from that failure, apart from what he played in my life? What can I understand about who he was and the struggles he went through? And how does understanding that teach me something about what it means to be a person? And so I don't know if any of us make it, Russell, to the Promised Land, like apart from when God returns.
Yeah.
Because maybe we're looking for a city whose builder and maker is God.
When you set out to write How Far to the Promised Land, this is different than the other stuff that you've written. This isn't New Testament scholarship. It's not essays. This is memoir. It may be the hardest kind of memoir because it's a multi-generational memoir.
Yeah.
What prompted you to do that?
Well, interestingly enough, the truth is, I realize now that books are hiding in other books. So if you open up Reading While Black, it says this book is dedicated to my father, who died during the writing of this book. So whatever else I am, I'm always your son. And everybody who read Reading While Black and opened it thought this was very sweet. Like he dedicated to his father, and they imagined this really positive relationship with me and my father. People have talked to me about it tons of times. But actually, that wasn't true. We didn't have a relationship at all. I was influenced by all of the things that he didn't help me with. And his absence led us in part into poverty, which kind of informs all that happens in Reading While Black, the kinds of things that I experienced that I didn't write about. And so it's, in a sense, even in Reading While Black, I was talking about him without talking about him. And so when it came time to write this book, it actually goes, believe it or not, up till 2017. So the chronology of the book goes up until Reading While Black was written. And then that's a separate world. And so I think that what it really was me trying to make sense of my story and telling the truth about my story. And what I really, so why did I do it? I did it because I wanted to tell the truth about how I became the kind of person who wrote and saw the world in the way that I do now. Part of it is really like all of the ways in which when you do something that succeeds, something like Reading My Black, and you become a New York Times columnist, people begin to ask you about your story. Mm-hmm. And like I said, they really want to hear the rags to riches story. They want to hear the story of it was hard and I overcame it. Mm-hmm. And I just really wanted the world to know that that's not the only story of what it means to grow up in poverty. Mm. That there are other people around who didn't make it and their stories matter too.
Yeah.
And I wanted to say that part of what it means to succeed in life is the responsibility of remembering and the responsibility to forgive. Mm. And that I had to learn to have compassion towards my father, but I was going to have compassion towards other broken people in the world. Mm. And part of what I do is when I was a pastor is to say, our stories aren't over. We aren't the worst things that we have done. And I said that was true about everybody else, but it wasn't true about my own family sometimes. Mm-hmm. And I said, I can't preach about grace if I can't find a way to extend grace to someone who harmed me. Mm-hmm. And the process of writing, the book is about the stories that I told or that I discovered while writing on his eulogy. And so the process of writing his eulogy of a man who I didn't know, but who was my father, really allowed me to forgive him in a deeper and more profound way. And it gave me the space in my own soul to forgive other people. And so if other people who read this story can find a way to see some beauty in the hard parts of their story, and to find their way towards forgiving people who disappointed them deeply, then I think that I have done my job, and that I've helped them understand the important poor people aren't just the survivors. Mm. The important poor people are the people who are trampled underfoot, and maybe we need to create a society that doesn't trample so many people. Mm.
One of the most powerful passages for me is early on in the book where I believe it's your sister who calls you to tell you about the death of your father. It's a powerful moment. I'm wondering how does that experience shape the way that, I mean, you're a dad. How does it shape Esau McCaulley, 2023 dad?
Yeah. I realize now, and me and my father are much different people, but I realize that at a certain point, our children are going to take stock of us as parents. Mm-hmm. They're going to leave our house and they're going to leave our influence and they're going to look back on their childhood. And I used to think that it was my job because my father had done such a bad job that I was going to be the perfect dad. Mm-hmm. I was never going to make mistakes. I was always going to love them. I was always going to have the wise words to say. But because my father failed me, I was very keenly aware of every time that I failed them. Mm-hmm. And I realized that no matter how much I love my children, I'm going to fail them. I can't be everything to them. Mm. Well, then what does that mean? What can I do? What I can do as a father is not be perfect, but I can love them as best as I can, and I can point them to the person who can love them perfectly. Mm-hmm. In other words, I hope that at the end of, as they look back upon their experiences of living with me and my wife, they say, those were flawed people, but they loved us as best as they could via the love of Jesus. And even if they didn't do everything right, they pointed me to the person who would never let me down. And so I now see my parenting mostly as testimony, not in the sense that like every single day I tell my kids about the Romans road, mm-hmm. but that I'm trying to love them in such a way that the love of God that I talk about is plausible in their lives.
Mm.
And so I feel like that's what I can do as a father. I used to think it was my job to kind of undo every mistake that he did.
Mm-hmm.
So everything he did bad to me, I would do good to them. But that doesn't give them the freedom to be who they are. It's like them stuck in this play. And the only way to free them from the play of them having to replay the role of me and I replayed the role of my father, like McCaulley's part 2,
Mm-hmm.
was for me to just love them as best as I could.
Yeah.
And when I failed them, to acknowledge it and to apologize and to say, Dad's inadequate as much as he loves you, but God has not failed you. And so that's what I try to do. And what I saw, and I don't want to give away all of the stuff. I want people to read it because I want them to get there. But sometimes messed up people love you in messed up ways.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't see that the bad things that they do were their own attempts to do good things. It sounds odd to say it that way. Like you can't see, like when you're a kid, you just don't know addiction, right?
Yeah.
So because you don't understand addiction, you see like them pawning your VCR as malice towards you.
Yeah.
Like my dad took my Nintendo because my dad hated me. Instead of my dad took my Nintendo because there was a biochemical reaction that he couldn't necessarily overcome. And that when I was a pastor, if I had someone who had addiction, I had a lot of compassion, but I didn't have that same kind of compassion for my father. And so this understanding that like broken people can try to love you, and that love is going to be distorted in a million ways by their own inadequacies. And I have more compassion on that now than I did when I was a kid. And I hope that one day, even though it's not drugs, it's whatever my inadequacies are, my children find that for me as well.
That's powerful. You know, that's true, I think, to greater and lesser extents, no matter what parenting is. I lost my dad too 3 years ago. And one of the things, writing the eulogy like you did,
Yeah,
it's, at least for me, it's a form of grieving.
it is.
And that was what I could do. I'm a writer.
Yeah.
I can sit down and write the eulogy, and I felt like I was doing something. But one of the things I realized uh, as I get older is how much, when you're a kid, whether your parents are present or absent, you always assume that they have a script
Yes.
that they're either following or ignoring. And I think it was in the months after my dad died that I started realizing how much I just assumed.
It
Well,
was wrong.
you ought to do
Yeah.
it this way, and that's
Yes.
not what life is like. And it was a little bit. It's getting easier to understand.
Yeah.
There was a time when I was really, I think, spiritually judgmental of my dad
Yeah.
because, he was the one who would never go to church with us. He was always
Yeah.
there, but he would never go to church with us and it wasn't until later I realized, yeah, he grew up in a parsonage right next to a Southern Baptist church where the business meetings would come to his house
Yeah.
all the time. There's something about just seeing that and realizing it that
One of
humanizes.
the things that was interesting is that when you're a kid, you think the story starts when you're born.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you're like the key moment. But my parents, this is not profound, but they existed before me.
Uh-huh.
They had a relationship that existed before me. And my father had a childhood. And I began to realize, like you said, oh, you can't understand him without understanding what happened to him and how those things influence him. And it doesn't undo all the bad things that he did, but it puts it in context.
Yeah.
And when I learned, like me and my father, probably in the first 33, 34 years of my life, probably never had a conversation more than 5 or 10 minutes. And so I didn't know anything about him. I mean, I knew that he drove a truck, that he had a drug addiction, that he was in and out of jail, and then he died. I mean, I knew that before. But I didn't know his story until really he passed away, and I went back and asked his sisters and these other people, and that is how the book opened up. It opened up because you can't simply tell my story or his story without putting the whole family in. That's why it's called One Family's Journey. And so I think that contextualizing people doesn't always solve all the problems, but it does open up the path, as we talked about earlier, towards empathy. And I think I have much more empathy towards my father than I did. And this is not, people who read the book will probably think that's a shocking thing to do. One of the other things is like really weird is, how can you love someone who really, really does bad things?
Mm-hmm.
And when you're a kid, you don't have anybody else to love.
Yeah.
So you don't have like an option of imagining another father. You just want a better version of the father that you have,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, and so I was trying to get at that feeling of, what does it mean to love someone who hurts you? And how do you make it? And the easiest way to do that is to, when you get older, to transform that love into hate.
Mm-hmm.
Because you love them and then they couldn't be what you wanted them to be, so you hated them.
Mm-hmm.
But then hate is kind of ultimately corrosive. Well, how do you find your way out of that hate? And that's what I was trying to get at different points.
Well, I think you succeeded. And one of the things that you did in the book is, it's really hard to communicate what you just said, loving people who hurt you, without saying, therefore, it doesn't matter that they hurt you. And you managed to show that and give an imaginative picture of the reality of that without sliding into that at all.
Yeah.
I wonder, you are a military spouse.
Yes.
And I'm a military dad, and I know we've got a lot of military spouses and parents that listen to this show, and kids. And I'm wondering, what have you learned about life being a military spouse and dad?
And I would say this is another example of nuance. I mean, what people imagine the military to be versus what it really is often different. Like, how I would have described the military as someone who's looking from the outside. But what I would say is, they're like the rest of the world. They are just oftentimes they need jobs. They need to take care of their families. Some are motivated by patriotic concerns. Some just fell into the military because it was something to do. And then they fell in love with the patriotic aspects of it. But what I saw as people who are under really difficult circumstances, trying to have healthy marriages and raise their children well. So, for example, you move every 2 to 3 years in the military.
Mm-hmm.
And so what does it mean where your kids meet one group of friends and then they connect with them, then they're off to the next place. And you begin to see how human community can actually embrace people. The best and most warm communities I ever had was military communities. Because nobody welcomes you like the military, because they understand what you're going through. And so it's amazing what it would be like to be stationed somewhere and have friends within a few months. And then you leave the military and you could be a place for 2 or 3 years and nobody invites you to their house.
Yeah.
And so I would say that the military community understands the difficulties of the life that they live. And so they support one another in ways that even maybe the church could learn from. Mm-hmm. What does it mean to say, you don't have to be a stranger in this community? And I would say the military does a great job of that. I would say that it is not easy to deal with having someone who you love and who you care about just disappear for 6 to 9 to 12 to 18 months. And it's not even just the danger, because some deployments are dangerous, but it's just a separation. How do you function as a family? How do you then reincorporate things? You begin to see like the long-term ramifications of previous military decisions. So we were stationed in Japan, and the tensions between America and Okinawa from World War II are still there, like because of the presence of a military bases. So you don't just see what it means to be an American soldier now. You see the ramifications of the decisions that we made 50 years ago. And so it does introduce you to the complexity. And the other thing is like, we tend to think of the military as one thing. It's not Republican or not Democrat, it's not independent. It's everybody's there. If you exist in society, you exist in the military. And the military is, in that sense, like America. And sorry, there's so many things I could say.
Like the old saying about the Catholic Church, here comes everybody.
But here's the other thing. Maybe this will be the thing. It is one thing, and I'll say this for my military families. It's one thing to say, I support the troops as some kind of vague statement, and then you put up a flag and it's kind of political. But like, what does it mean to say, can the enlisted people live a livable wage?
Yeah.
Do you have the kind of resources to take care of veterans after they get out? In other words, I sometimes get frustrated when supporting the military simply means I generally think that militaries are good, versus what kind of things do our military servicemen and their families need to thrive, and how can I support that? And trust me, like, simply saying I support you is not the same as giving practical support to people.
Yeah.
And people don't see it. I remember when I was, when my wife deployed, I was, because she was a reservist. And so we were out in like normal world here at Wheaton College. She was going 8.5 months. And like nobody, and Wheaton was great. So I don't want to say that I'm criticizing the people, but they didn't understand what that was like. Like, what do you mean she's gone? And like they knew about it, but they didn't really, there was nobody around who had also gone through that. And so, but in my military community, they would have understood exactly what that was like, and they would have been able to support it. But because we can't imagine it, we sometimes tend not to know even how to help. Yeah. And so I just want to say that I have a lot more compassion and understanding of the sacrifices of not just the military, but their families than I would have had I never been a part of it.
Best church experience that Maria and I have ever had, hands down, was a congregation right by an Air Force base that was made up almost entirely of Air Force people or retired Air Force people. And it was because of exactly what you're saying. They knew how to make community really quickly. They knew how to welcome people and see who was lonely and incorporate them. And I remember thinking one time, wouldn't it be great if the church was teaching this to the Air Force rather than the Air Force teaching this to the church? Well, the book is called How Far to the Promised Land, One Black Family's Story of Hope and Survival in the American South. It's out, I think, September the 12th. But you can go ahead and pre-order that now, and it will be here. It'll be here when it comes out. And so, Esau, one last question. Okay. You wrote this memoir. What are some memoirs that you would say are among your favorites?
Man, am I allowed to say that everyone should probably go and read our buddy Beth Moore's memoir?
Yeah, absolutely.
And memoirs. I mean, I want to say like I've read, I don't know these counts as memoirs, but like some of Martin Luther King's self-reflection about his life. I read the autobiography of Malcolm X. I read James Baldwin's kind of autobiographical stuff. This might sound like to completely derail the conversation, but I kind of wanted to write a Black 7-story mountain. Or a Black like Surprised by Joy. In other words, there's a lot of spiritual journey biographies. And I know that people say like, how is this in there? It's in there. Yeah. And there are a lot of kind of even Augustine's Confessions of these stories of people going through this process of finding God in the midst of these difficult circumstances. And even though I couldn't identify with those circumstances at all, they spoke about something about what it meant to be human, and I could kind of travel along with it. And so there is the story of forgiveness and all of those things. But like the person moving through their story and making sense of it is me. And part of what it means to make sense of that story is finding God in it. And so if people read to the very end and they see it in different places, the chapter call and response and the closing and the eulogy kind of gets to it. And so what I really wanted to evoke was the sense of not just here's a story of learning to forgive, but it was inseparable from my own spiritual making sense of what it meant for me to be a Christian, to understand my past.
Mm-hmm.
And so 7-Story Mountain might seem to be like a black 7-story mountain might be an odd way to describe how far to the promised land. But,
But I get it. I think you're onto something there. I can see it.
So yeah, I would say Thomas Merton. It's funny, when you said memoir, I thought secular, but no, something like C.S. Lewis's Surprised by Joy and Thomas Merton's 7-Story Mountain influenced. There's another one, and it's not a memoir, but they're I think like 4 biographies. It's called The Life You Say May Be Your Very Own.
Oh, that's great. Oh, yes, that's
so
one
all
of
of
my
those
favorites.
kinds of stories were influencing what I was trying to do.
Yeah. That is a fantastic book, and also, I mean, Baldwin is so gripping as a
Coates. So like, what happens? What happens if like? Sorry, I don't want to be overly ambitious. What if you just toss God into the middle of between the world and me?
Mm-hmm.
And that you're that Ta-Nehisi isn't just, making sense of the struggle, but it's the struggle in the context of where is God in the midst of all of this.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not an easy, it's not, I hope y'all buy it, because it's not designed to be easily digestible, but I felt like I couldn't tell a true story about any of this without including the spiritual struggle in it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm glad that you asked me that. Like, all of those kinds of stories are floating around in the back of my head when I was working on it.
I sometimes, when I'm rereading Baldwin's, I think it's Go Tell It on the Mountain. I think
Yeah,
this
Go
is
Tell It on the Mountain,
where he has this section talking about being a boy preacher and
Yeah.
seeing kind of seeing the backside of it and starting to think it was just acting.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really just heartbreaking. You almost want to get in a time machine and go backward and say, introduce James Baldwin to a different vision of Jesus than what a lot of people see.
I mean, even it's in there. Sorry, it's in The Souls of Black Folks. It's in, like, in other words, a lot of African American intellectual essayist genre has a spiritual component that sometimes gives way to cynicism. I'm not making any statements about anyone's. I'm just speaking about like this vibe that I get.
Yeah.
What happens if some of those writers found a way not to through that deep cynicism into a place of articulate hope? Now, sometimes there's an echo of a whisper of something, and you got to go, maybe they found their way. But what if no? What if on the other side, they found this robust anchoring in like the person of Jesus himself as a means of carrying their story forward? And how could you tell that in a way that doesn't feel like we're overly simplistic? And so all of those people like Baldwin, Coates, Du Bois, all of those people, Malcolm in a certain sense, Martin in a certain sense, are all there. Zora Neale Hurston, all of these people are there with me as I'm writing, and I'm trying to enter into those conversations on my own terms.
Well, the book is beautiful. How Far to the Promised Land. It will really, you'll be glad you read it. So just listeners, you will be glad you read it. Just trust me on that one. Esau McCaulley, thank you so much for being with me today. I have a new book coming out on August the 1st of this year. It's called Losing Our Religion, an Altar Call for Evangelical America. And really what this book is about is how to navigate the craziness that we're all facing right now. How did we get to the point of exhaustion that so many people are facing? Why are so many people leaving the church? not because they can't believe what the church teaches, but because they don't believe the church believes what the church teaches. How can evangelical Christianity ever turn around? What would that look like, and how do we get there? That's what this book is about, and you can pre-order it in the show notes, and I look forward to sharing it with you August 1st. Thanks for listening. Links are always in the show notes for resources mentioned in this episode, including a link about how you can have a trial membership to Christianity Today. Be sure to subscribe to the program, send an episode along to a friend who might benefit from it, and leave us a review when you can. It helps other people to find the show wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Russell Moore, and this is The Russell Moore Show from Christianity Today.
The Russell Moore Show is a production of Christianity Today. Executive producers are Eric Petrick, Russell Moore, and Mike Cosper. Hosted by Russell Moore, produced by Ashley Hales, associate producers Abby Perry and Azrae Phelps, CT administration provided by Christine Kolb, social media by Kate Lucky, director of operations for CT Media is Matt Stevens, production assistance provided by Core Media. Audio engineer is Kevin Duthu. Coordinator is Beth Grabencourt. Video producer is John Rowland. The theme song for The Russell Moore Show is Dusty Delta Day by Lennon Hutton.